I'm here not only to introduce our first keynote speaker, but also to pay a tribute to one of the most important Brazilian applied linguists, internationally recognized as such. Luiz Paulo da Moita Lopes, PhD in Applied Linguistics from the University of London, full professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, is one of the founders of Applied Linguistics in Brazil, along with Antonieta Celani and others. His first book, Oficina de Linguística Aplicada, Applied Linguistics Workshop, published in 1996, is a landmark in applied linguistics in Brazil and is still today present in the bibliography of several entrance exams. Luiz Paulo was one of the first researchers concerned with identity issues in Brazil and is a reference name in studies of gender and sexuality. In 2006, he published Por uma Linguística Aplicada Indisciplinar, Towards Undisciplined Applied Linguistics, which brilliantly highlights a turning point in applied linguistics, from solving language-related problems to creating intelligibility for social issues in which language plays a central role, from interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity to indisciplinarity and transgression. Luiz Paulo has published 11 books and countless articles and chapters, nationally and internationally. His research interests include the relationship between discourse and social practices, focusing on literacy studies and the performative construction of gender, sexuality, and race. He has also focused on issues related to language and globalization, especially concerning how these issues may demand theoretical, methodological, and epistemological challenges in applied linguistics. I'm not sure if I was able to express the relevance of Luiz Paulo's contribution to applied linguistics studies. Maybe not. But to end on a personal note, I would like to say, Luiz Paulo, it was an honor to have you as my supervisor. If I'm here today, I owe this to you. Thank you for everything.
Good evening, everybody. I'm quite honored to have been invited to give this plenary. I know it was a very local choice and very local time, but I must say I'm very honored. Okay? Can y'all hear me now? It took me a while to decide on how to do this in which language we speak. At some point, I thought about translanguaging, and I can speak some Spanish. I love Spanish, but I think to save time, I decided just to make use of the transparencies in Spanish and Portuguese, and some of it will be done in Portuguese as well, I think, when I get to the data session. I want to thank the organizers, again, in particular the local committee. They're very young and we work together, and I'm very, very proud of them. It's very rare that you see such committed people and so young. Okay, I'll start with an overview of the talk. I'll give a very short introduction in which I'll highlight the two main points of the talk, and then I'll move into queer theorizing, modernity and Occidentalism, pharmacopower and techno-capitalism, a supplementary logic within queer theorizing, queer negativity. In this section, I present a biopolitics of the now, articulating decolonial studies with queer theorizing. And then I'll move into how queer in applied linguistics needs to account for a biopolitics of the now, and then move into some guiding points to queer applied linguistics. And then I'll discuss some queer research, social linguistically informed applied linguistics. And then I'll conclude by talking about the future is the time of hope. I must say that I'm not claiming at all that this is the only way of doing applied linguistics. Fortunately, we are in a field in which we have different ways of doing applied linguistics, different cultures, and I celebrate that. I want to start by quoting a Brazilian woman, Nise da Silveira, an internationally renowned psychiatrist, because of her unconventional treatment of patients through art. She actually said this sentence in an interview which is shown in a great film called Nise, about her life. There are more than 1,000 ways of belonging to life and of fighting for them in our times. I start with this epigraph because it draws attention to two important points of this talk. The first is the fundamental need in our perhaps neo-fascist or perhaps fascist times of continually reaffirming performativities outside the modernist, colonial, purist ideals of language. I want to emphasize this. Race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, nationality, etc. Although I'm talking about gender and race and sexuality, I want to emphasize the need of avoiding this terrible, purist ideals of language, which particularly, I get really annoyed in the fields such ours, where everybody speaks different language, and particularly when it comes to English. What is English? There are more than 1,000 ways of belonging to life, as Nise da Silveira says. The second is what I'll refer to later as research which speaks to our times and which makes its political bias explicit. In Nise's words, there are more than 1,000 ways of fighting for different ways of belonging to life. I share with Boaventura de Souza Santos, a well-known Portuguese sociologist, the idea that doing research in the social sciences necessarily involves the construction of a discourse about social life while trying to understand it. And second, the need of focusing on emerging topics through what I've called an applied linguistics of the emergent. We should, and these are Boaventura's words, we should try to see the signs, clues, latency, existing possibilities in the present, which index the future, are emerging possibilities in our disbelief, because they are embryos, and as such are not very visible. I'll now move into these 2 points as I discuss the need for queer theorizing. Queer, as you know, is an English word used to refer to gay men in a derogatory manner, and which has been appropriated in the academy through what may be understood as a catachresis process, when a word is used in a way that significantly differs from conventional usage. The word queer in queer theories is in fact now used in so-called English in different languages, in different parts of the world, in different fields of knowledge, and it predicates theories in which queer as a theoretical construct problematizes any transcultural trans-historical and universalist view of gender and sexualities, taken as such to be a constellation of multiple and unstable positions, in the words of de Gaulle. Gender and sexuality are seen in a continual becoming process. Queer theories adopt a de-essentialized perspective which admits no fixed binaries to explain masculinity or femininity and heterosexuality or homosexuality. Nevertheless, different authors may claim different perspectives or emphasis within the queer theory framework. Although queer has been first used by feminist Teresa Dolores, it is the work of Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick which are considered to have been the first to inform the development of queer theories. These theories have been particularly influenced by feminist and post-structural theorizing. Following Austin, Derrida, and Foucault, among others, Butler has argued that gender sexuality is not something we are, but something we do. When we do gender and sexuality, our actions bring about semantic effects in the world which are interpreted by a heteronormative matrix. That is to say that there is no being behind the doing, but semantic effects which through repetition provide substance to what is in fact fiction, since repetition is never the same. Furthermore, queer theorists have taken an intersectional turn by arguing that gender sexuality needs to be considered in relation to class, race, ethnicity, religion, age, and nationality. Such an intersectional turn further destabilizes any sense of normativity for our bodies. Both heteronormativity and homonormativity, for example, become senseless. It's not possible to prefigure the kinds of performativities our bodies will call into being. In line with Barnard, I believe that the queer theory cannot stand alone, or at least it cannot stand for sexuality alone. Or as Preciado says, very interesting Spanish researcher, there is no sexual difference, but a multitude of differences, a transversality of power relations, a diversity of life potencies. Queer theories have been so influential that now quite a few fields of study have been referred to as having been queer. Queer geography, queer sociology, queer religious studies, queer linguistics, for example. Usually this implies a special concern with gender sexuality as a category for analysis in these fields which traditionally, from a Marxist and neo-Marxist perspective, have excluded desire. Furthermore, as Halberstam argues, because sexuality was considered all as a personal body local issue outside what supposedly really matters, i.e. class, global political concern, sexuality and gender were put aside from fundamental issues of our time: translocalization and globalization and their economic consequences. Modernity and Occidentalism. Several authors, Mignolo, Bauman, Briggs, Benn, Sosa Santos, and Bandy, have argued that colonialism has been central in defining the proper and pure body and subjectivity in a modernist Occidentalist logic. Bauman and Briggs have drawn attention to the role of a purist, neutral, autonomous, and representational linguistic ideology underlying the fields of philosophy, politics, anthropology, and other fields, and I would add applied linguistics, which has sustained this logic and the inequalities it entails. Modernity, capitalism, and the perennial colonial process in the westernization of the world have been paramount in defining the body the bodies that matter, to recall Butler, or a biopolitics, to recall Foucault, or a thanatopolitics, to recall Agamben, or a necropolitics, to recall Mbembe, or a queer necropolitics, to recall Kua. This is still a fundamental element of the world in which we live. Gender, sexuality, race, etc., within ideals of purity, in essence, are constitutive of modernity, persistent delirium, backed up by colonial science and by the statutization of biology, as the Cameroonian philosopher Mbembe says. Such ideals are still manifested in the form of discourses and practices which, through repetition, normativize male heterosexual and white bodies, etc., against which otherness is constructed. Any deviance from this normativity is to be disciplined, normativized, or even eliminated. Of course, the writing of history along this period has had a performative dimension in that connection, as Bambi said, and has found it hard to account for the vagrancy our bodies have always experienced. Such vagrancy is somehow untamed nowadays in a contingent, globalized, and translocalized world in which some of us live within a profusion of negotiated narratives in the social media and through physical border crossing. The warm, so to speak, are now out of the box for many of us, I must stress. In many parts of the world, so-called traditional biopower normalizations have been challenged, and other stories have been told about who we are, or can be amidst what Hart and Negri have referred to as multitude, and Preciado has called queer multitudes. However, authority phobia, as Mandy puts it, is coming back as the norm in many parts of the world. Fear of immigrants has resulted in strict secularization measures, even in countries such as Brazil, which is far from the main immigration contentious areas. Also, what is popularly referred to as gender theory has been demonized by religious and conservative groups in many parts of the world. This issue has in fact become quite a problem in Brazil. We live times when there is a tremendous need of historicizing the biopolitics of the now for an applied linguistics of the emergent. Another important concern in this biopolitics of the now in connection to queer theories is pharmaco power and techno-capitalism. In order to more completely understand the contingent narratives of our contemporary bodies, it's crucial to take into account what Paul Beatriz Preciado refers to as pharmacopower and techno-capitalism. This has increased the possibilities of physically transforming our bodies into different performativities through pharmaco products and surgeries, moving us more easily into a transgender world. One of the references, a fascinating book, appeared a long time ago. It just it appeared in 2008 in Spanish, but recently in English. And also I would like to refer to Rodrigo Barber's wonderful work, The Unlearning of the Self, Transsexuality, Interaction, and Care of the Self, in which he discusses interaction in a transsexual clinic in Rio de Janeiro. I don't have much time to discuss this crucial issue of a biopolitics of the now, but I refer you to these authors. A supplementary logic within queer theorizing. David Scott, West Indian cultural theorist, argues that we need to operate by means of strategic supplementary logic if you want to refashion our futures. On the one hand, we need to operate by means of the strategic essentialism which Spivak talked about, à la Fanon, but at the same time we need to refuse limiting essentialism and queer the ready-made performances which normativization wants to box us into, operating therefore à la Foucault, and live in a continual becoming, which I think is a major political and ethical perspective. It's thus necessary to think about who we can become, investing in performativity, innovation, on the basis of the traces of the faith, repetition. From a different perspective, but echoing Scott's view, by allowing for essentialism and continual becoming, Poor, in a very interesting, perhaps controversial book called Terrorist Assemblage, raises a distinction between the subject being queer and queerness already existing within the subject, and thus dissipating the subject as such. Poor's view then allows for both temporality of being, ontological essence of the subject, temporal, and the temporality of always becoming, continual ontological emergence, a Deleuzian becoming without being. Queer negativity. I'm using this trope to account for a series of other more recent queer theoreticians, Edelman, Halberstam, Poor, Munoz, Ahmed, Bernini, Marti, for example. Although they differ in a lot of aspects, for the purpose of this talk, I'll try to single out the features which frame the ideas under the label of queer negativity. These theoreticians have been very critical of gay normalization. It has sprung from a need of attending to a neoliberal world in which gayness, in particular, has been transformed into a type of market niche to be catered for, the so-called pink market. This gay normalization process has also been associated with the promise of happiness, as Ahmed puts it. Typical of capitalist cultures in which consumption is the happiness to search for, and in which the thinking positive, I have to mention my mother here, she gets very annoyed with stuff of thinking positive. Being successful, ideologies are fundamental. Being accepted by a larger portion of society because one constitutes a strong consumption sector, or is allowed credit cards, no longer qualifies one as abject. Munoz, for example, questions the ethical dimension involved in this normalization in a corrupt economic and consumerist system, while most people around the world is having to make ends meet within economic principles oriented by austerity, neoliberal economic regulation, and we are facing in this country right now, believe it or not. Constitutive of this normalization are also the relative recent possibilities of marriage for LGBTIQ+, as well as those related to child adoption or to artificially inseminated pregnancy. Marriage and reproduction have been traditionally fathomed as the essential part of human life, without which it cannot be considered an adequate or normal life, or a life with a future. Or perhaps the issue relates to how we can control eros through marriage, a biopolitical mechanism, as Mari refers to. In this logic, single people and childless couples are abnormal or weirdos. Constructing a traditional type of family through marriage and children changes how LGBTIQ+ are constructed in social life, since they move in the direction of normative society. Thus, one has all the credentials to be responsive to a neoliberal world, or perhaps one has achieved what's crucial for a normalized society, so-called. This position, on the one hand, aligns with some kind of social inclusion. On the other, it may be in full opposition to queer theories, since it pigeonholes people in very clear ways and leaves aside the performativities of those who are poor, have multiple love sexual partners, do not need a place called home to have sex, are not interested in having a traditional nuclear family with a joint bank account, etc. The question is that the kind of social justice we want? As a consequence, queer theorists have been refusing to accept the so-called inclusion process because it means saying yes to a normative neoliberal order, basically capital-flex, renters, the commodification of human life in all its aspects, and also the need to take into account reproductive sexuality, generating what could be called the homonormative subject. Some queer theorists in opposition have thus been arguing for queer negativity, failure, or the position of objection, etc. In this sense, LGBTIQ+ should opt out and not blend in, as Ahmed points out. By arguing for queer negativity, queer theoreticians are arguing against the depoliticization of life, including queer life, as Marty puts it, against the regularization of deviancy, as Bua puts it, against the neoliberal ideals of contemporary life, as Halberstam says, and for a death-driven ethic or the self-annihilation logic. It's that one. I don't agree with the book at all, but it's a very well-argued book. The queer negativity, the queer negative theoreticians have argued that there is no possibility of a better future for LGBTIQ+. The objection failure trope places them in a position from which they can be critical of the neoliberal ideals of contemporary life, which are sweeping across most parts of the world. And I'll come back to queer negative as I close. Excuse me. Queer in applied linguistics, taking into account the biopolitics of the now. What I've tried to do so far was to briefly construct the biopolitics of the now, or a discourse about social life which informs in applied linguistics of the emergent. Obviously, AILA too, I'm organizing social life by assembling my objects of study. By taking into account queer negativity, my argument has similarities with authors in other fields, for example, sociology, geography, philosophy, cultural studies, and these are the authors who have asked for the need of considering the voice of those who have lived in the margins as a result of colonialism, and therefore articulating decoloniality, theorizing with queer theory. I believe that marginalized and abject lives, social class, cultural, sexual, racial, gender, and their intersectionalities have been less affected, imprisoned, or colonized by the hegemony of modernity, creating alternatives interspecially outside the neoliberal canon. More importantly, their performativities may be more helpful in contributing to the understanding of the world in which we live, since they have been speaking back to the world, resisting traditional meanings, and inaugurating new discourses. However, these phenomena have also generated anger, hate, and crime in many parts of the world which refuse to accept alternative narratives alternative narrative to modernist colonial prescriptions for our bodies. This fact has thus increases the political voltage for queering applied linguistics. Querying applied linguistics, some guiding points. On the basis of what I've said, described so far, I want to put together some guiding points. Focus on practice, where people performatively construct their lives. This view entails operating outside the traditional identity paradigm, a shift from focusing on identity to practice, as Olu and Lung point out, which allows for the study of performativities and not of prefigured identities. The limits of performativities are determined by practice-situated otherness. 2. Denormalization of the traditional subject in the field, the student, the teacher, the interviewee, the blogger, etc. We need to seriously take research participants' bodies into consideration in how they are performatively enacted. Bodies need to be racialized and sexualized beyond sexual and racial normativity, accounting as such for intersectionality, class, age, nationality, religion, etc. Awareness of contemporary biopolitics and securitization which have transformed bodies into species. For example, what is the truth of your body when border crossing these days? In particular, awareness of modernity's persistent delirium in relation to colonial essentialist views of bodies. 4. Awareness of the power-infused relations in the research act itself, since alternatives are both institutionally and interpersonally constitutive of research, of the research process. This perspective entails critical proximity and not critical distance, or perhaps it should entail personal engagement. Focus on interpretativist, qualitative, ideographic investigation, since the researcher and the research need to be reflexively accounted for in queer research. The idiosyncratic nature of research is what counts as epistemologically valid to fathom performativity. If what is relevant is practice and critical proximity in our rapid changing times in which our performativities are brought into being, we need an ethnography of the transit or of the flux, perhaps beyond multi-sided ethnography. 6. Discourse, semiotic, textual analysis need to be taken into account to understand meaning construction in fast-flowing practice. Some of these methodological analytical perspectives is what actually comes up in Brown and Nash's book on queer methodologies, although queer theory does not encompass a methodological program per se, as King and Cronin point out. 7. Focus on an antidisciplinary research endeavor is central, since queer research should take it beyond the usual departmentalized discipline, but also to the researchers' personal cultural life experiences of cinema and drama, fiction, poem reading, popular culture, social media, and in the knowledge construction process. Many emergent issues in social life which have a bearing on our performativities are better understood in contemporary cultural practice. Practice is the head of theory in our contingent in rapid time. Or theory is practice under another name, as Sousa Santos says. In fact, a lot of queer theoreticians construct their arguments by analyzing cultural practices. 8. Focus on an indisciplinable research mode. Queer applied linguistics necessarily thematize what is not normally investigated because it has not been considered an applied linguistics topic, or perhaps has been hidden under the living room carpet in some of our applied linguistic circles. Transgressing traditional discourses is fundamental if one is to be responsive to our time, and in fact, if one wants to construct knowledge that speaks to our time. Alternatively, we could think, as Halberstam does, this is not a bad time to experiment with disciplinary transformation on behalf of the project of generating new forms of knowing, since the fields that were assembled 100 years ago to respond to new market economies and demand for narrow expertise, as Foucault described them, are now losing relevance and failing to respond either to real-world knowledge projects or students' interests. Some queer research, social linguistically informed, applied linguistics. When I was asked to write the abstract for this talk more than a year ago, I was under the impact of the devastating news that a student of our faculty had been murdered on campus. Diego Machado was an undergraduate student, and he identified himself as gay and black. So here you have my concern with doing queer research in applied linguistics, which is clearly politically engaged, and as such wants to collaborate with the need of being responsive to our times operating on a particular view of social life. This is the face of Diego, graffitied by students on our faculty walls just after Diego's murder. What I'll do now is to present some social linguistically informed applied linguistics research to illuminate what Bambi has called modernity's persistent delirium, which insistently and violently search for purity and essence in a perennial coloniality process. I'll focus on how Diego's murder by exploring how this sad event was contextualized in the media, followed different text trajectories across the web, and in such re-contextualization, it indexed different cues. It indexed different discourses about Diego's murder. I'll center on indexicalization cues, on the discourses or histories of meaning these cues signal to and contextualize, and on how Diego's body and murder are scaled in these text trajectories. Such a view is aligned with the theoretical perspective, moves away from essentialism and immobility, linguistic system, race, sexuality, and takes into account movement or how meanings are performatively brought into being or forged out through scalar activities. Let's skip that. In order to grasp such dimensions, I'll follow what Branca Fabricio, 2014, has called a tracking text as a research methodology. To take into consideration the meanings which the re-contextualization of Diego's murder bring up in the malleable context that meaning construction mobilized. The first text has been written by Diego himself. He reports on a guy who was sexually abused and beaten up on campus. Diego posted this text on the 7th of April 2016, about 3 months before he himself was murdered. It is still available on his Facebook page. In a very premonitory manner, Diego anticipated the contextualization of his own murder, as it were. I'll let you go through, but through it, but if you just pay attention to the sections in red, my analogy will make more sense to you. By contextualizing a story about a young man who was sexually abused, this is what you hope you're following me. This is what Diego posted on his page when this sad event happened to a colleague of his. By contextualizing a story about a young man who was sexually abused and tortured on campus, Diego is perspectivizing the homophobic context in which he himself lives by signaling to the discourse sex which crisscross the discursive ethos in which he is inserted. These discursive ethos will be further recovered from the intertextualization to follow. The time, space, scales organize the event. Yesterday, construction works on the street, the physical education course, event site, campus prefecture, dormitory, and establish a comparison which signals to the university internal security's lack of diligence in performing their tasks. The half an hour versus the Diego's 15 minutes to cover the same distance. The attacked young man is predicated as sexually abused, tortured, naked, and humiliated, whereas the internal security guards, who are once again classified as neglectful, they did not use an occurrence form, did not take the guy for further inquiry or to the doctor. This predication indexes criticism as of the guards, as if the guards were saying there is no rush, nothing that serious happened. Furthermore, Diego makes use of cynic modality by quoting the words the guard used. But what are you doing there? Such indexical cues also signal to discourses which paradoxically transform the victim into the offender, which is typical of bigoted practices. The internal security guards are in the end qualified by Diego as actors who do so to cover their associate sexual abusers. Time, space, categorization, comparison, predication, modality scales are made recourse to by Diego to forge out the homophobic practices in which he lives. It's, however, ironic and disturbingly sad that Diego anticipates his own death. I don't have the time to look into the following text, but I must say that this was published by Diego about 2 months later, 12 days before he was killed. On the 12th of June, Diego substituted his picture on his Facebook for this message. Asking respect for sexuality, I just want to draw your attention to how Diego employs specific signs, pure and respect, which index contrasting discourses, perhaps religious, medical discourses, and ethical ones. And these cues do help to reconstruct Diego's homophobic ethos. Now we move into the first text, about Diego's murder. And this is the first text in which his murder was contextualized. This is published by G1, which is the site of the most popular TV channel in Brazil. And again, I ask you to pay attention to these words. Found dead, was born in Belém do Pará, which is the north of the country. Carol Gonçalves, a colleague of his, she says it's a hate crime. He was my best friend. We had met less than a year ago. Hate crime, homophobia, and racism. He was black and was sexually open, had sex with men. According to Diego's friend, he was a tall and strong man. He was found with bruises and without his pants on. And then Carol comes in again. He knew how to fight, and I don't think the crime was committed by only one person. He was in the university judo team and was a kung fu fighter. And the last thing I want to draw attention to is that he was called the Paraíba. Paraíba is the way northeastern or northern people are referred to in the south, or perhaps in Rio. as a derogatory term. Some 12 days later, Juan text equaled Diego's Facebook text by contextualizing the same homophobic discourses as the cause of his death. Juan side epistemologically mobilizes what's narrated by contextualizing Diego's friend's voice into the text. Perula perspectivizes the crime as homophobic and racist since Diego was black and had sex with men. She narrates a similar kind of physical attack as Diego described on his Facebook page. Diego's body is predicated as having bruises and found without his pants on, despite the fact that she constructively described him as a tall and a strong man, knew how to fight, was in the university judo team, and was a kung fu fighter. This contrast is the reason she constructs for his crime having been committed by more than one person. Perula also adds an extra racist feature. He was a Paraíba. And it's noteworthy, however, that Diego's body is portrayed as performativizing semantic effects which are not commonsensically associated homosexual borders: strength, fight, judo team, and kung fu. Such discursive effects normalize homonormativity and therefore further draw attention to his queer body. Next text is found in the Rio da Homofobia Institute site. He was a Costista student. I just want to draw your attention to this word. Costista means that he was accepted into the university through a positive discriminatory system which quite recently has been adopted in Brazil. In the Rio da Homofobia Institute retextualization, a further categorization for Diego's body was added. He was a Costista. He had been accepted into the university through the relatively recent positive discrimination entrance exam system. This adds another feature to the semantic effects his body brings about: homoerotic, black, Paraíba, poor, and Costista. These relative scales redimension how his intersectional performativities were perceived and downgraded. I followed retextualization of this event in several other media, but I want to use the time I've left to focus on the retextualization of the event in a university right-wing student page called O EPJ da Opressão, or Oppressive EPJ. The page opens with a picture of a right-wing former member of the army who is now a politician and is a bigoted provocateur, to be very polite. The fellow was found dead on the Fundão Island with bruises on his body. It was a crime, a homicide. The fascists come back. This is a very weird use of the word fascist. Fascists sometimes go in different ways, in the way of cussing somebody, but that's not the way I mean. I'll talk about it a bit later. The fascist scumbags have stuck to the fact that the victim is gay. Quickly and morbidly, they started to capitalize on the crime in view of the pro-faggot agenda they defend. The authors of the student page predicate those who have been classifying the murder as a result of homophobia as fascist scumbags. As I said, it's very funny, a weird way. Because they follow a pro-faggot agenda jihadista or agenda de maricón. The page scales this type of agenda negatively by indexing homophobic discourse. And this is the last text. A gay man died, homophobia allegation. A black man died, racist allegation. A chap explodes himself shouting, Allahu Akbar, God is great. We have to be careful with our allegations. In their last sentences, the page authors try to reconstruct the kind of cause-effect, logical reasoning the fascist scumbags make by equating so-called fascist comebacks make by equating the death of a gay man with homophobic discourses and the death of a black man with racist discourses. This is hardly logical if one considers the homophobic and racist discourses Diego himself and his colleagues signaled to and the ethoses in which they live. Comparatively, the authors argue that the scumbags would not use the same kind of reasoning if an Islamic man exploded himself shouting, "God is great." Therefore, the kind of discursive alignment those who blame murders like Diego's on homophobia and racism take up is scaled down and is ironically compared with their supposedly left-wing and inadequate support of terrorists. This kind of comparison can only be understood on a translocal basis and through what has been called a scale jump from local political issues, homophobic and racist attacks, to a translocal one, international politics. The last text I came across 2 weeks ago in this graffiti on our faculty outside wall facing the rectory, which was recently drawn by students exactly a year after Diego was killed. The text interpellates us all in connection with the fact that there has been no final solution to the crime so far. And unfortunately, the text indexes discourses related to what Judge B. Poor has called a queer necropolitics. Who killed Diego? Quem matou Diego? This set of narratives index a long, diverse story which only now has become more explicit in Brazil. Certainly the web does play a role in making these narratives explicit, but it's not only that, as I will soon argue. And now I'm coming to the end. The future is the time of hope. I understand that Diego's murder, both nationally and internationally, coincides with right-wing and fascist turns in many parts of the world, which are now pervasive in many political parties and in other institutions. As Sousa Santos says, he says we, but I prefer to say many of us, live in politically democratic societies of low and very low intensity, but which are socially fascist. Basically, fascism, as the Brazilian philosopher Paulo points out, involves three main dimensions, which you should have in mind in the biopolitics of the now. One, state violence and authoritarian government practices. Two, abusive practices towards vulnerable groups. And three, construction of social cohesion through paranoid use of nationalism and of border, territory, and identity defense. I'm sure lots of you are very familiar with this practice. In Brazil, not to mention other countries, unfortunately, infectious fascist reintellectualizations are rapidly pressuring towards the deinstitutionalization of relatively recently acquired social rights during the more socially concerned government between 2002 and 2013, which somehow improved the lives of women, of blacks, LGBTIQ+, indigenous minorities, and the so-called underclass Brazilian population. The recent close down of federally funded secretaries, to which both our representative of our rector and our dean of our faculty, the director of our faculty, mentioned, the recent close down of federally funded secretaries in this country, which directly cater for social justice, have generated amazingly quick political fascist attacks, almost as if the Serpent's Egg had been hatched through all the more recent democratic years. Or to paraphrase Bertolt Brecht, the fascist ditch had always been in heat throughout these years. A cadela do fascismo Está sempre no cio. I would best to suggest that in a queer applied linguistics informed by a biopolitics of the now, we should not take what I have previously referred to as queer negativity as a parameter. We shouldn't have in mind the position of objection, failure, and no future. Rather, we should consider what Band-Aid refers to as the relevance of taking into account responsibility and duty as springing directly from how we fathom the future, since the time of the future is that of hope. Munoz points to the possibility of a critical and utopian practice of hope in the face of loss, which he calls queer futurity, involving a collective political attitude. That's not to say that I do not think that the serious and harsh criticism towards neoliberal principles put forward by queer negativist theoreticians should not orient our lives and research. I certainly do not want societies in which renters becomes the head of people. To my disgust, I recently read that Christine Lagarde, the head of IMF, complained about human longevity. Also, I do not think that marriage and children are necessarily the solution for queer futurity. And I'm coming to the end. I think queer theories can help us pave our ways differently by looking forward to the future. They can help us to get involved with a continual exercise for destroying modernity's persistent and harmful certainties, or crystallized recontextualizations about who we are. They can help us to potentially, and I emphasize, potentially forge other futures or other intertextualizations for ourselves and others in a queer time and place, as Halston points out. And I'm definitely closing out. These futures and intertextualizations can inaugurate other possibilities which are not afraid of who we are or are continually becoming. On the contrary, we look forward to these futures, and we do so by querying applied linguistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my voice is gone. The yellow bracelet should be worn so participants can have access to the cocktail party, okay? Bem-vindo, bienvenido, welcome, and thank you for coming to AILA World Congress in Rio 2017. We wish you all an intense and a challenging academic, cultural, and touristic week in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Thank you.